Hello, everybody. This is Matt Harris with the Magento Association Podcast. Today, we have the pleasure of speaking to Ben Marks. Welcome, Ben.
Thanks for having me.
All right. So for those of you that don't know, Ben Marks has been in the e-commerce community for a long time. He's been in the Magento community for a long time. So we're going to start off with Ben giving us a little bit of a background, how he got to be where he is today, and kind of some of the experiences he had along the way since he got into this industry. So, Ben, I'll cue it up there. That's a big, broad one. So you can slice that one up however you want.
I got a lot of developers in the 2000s. I had kind of stumbled across PHP. My background, I got a psychology degree, and I promptly, after college went on to just playing music full time. And then through a series of startups, it's a story I've told a few times, basically I had helped someone do, basically race prep a car. And he was like, well, I did to do the wiring harness. He's like, well, basically building a website is the same thing. So I stumbled into programming that way. So that was, 2003 or so. By 2006, I'd landed in a local web agency that was, we had a real young, gifted developer who had created a component library out of like the beta version of Zen Framework. Mm-hmm. And then the guy running that shop he was an interesting guy, maybe not the best business person. So I ended up looking for a job the very first day that Kevin Eichelberger, who had founded Blue Acorn, was looking for his first employee here in Charleston. And I sent him what was, I've reviewed it since then. It was the worst cover letter in the history of cover letters, but he bit, and we met, and the rest is history. Now I told him, I was like, well, I'm an expert with Zen, so Magento won't be any problem. Mm-hmm. That narrator, that was not the case. Yeah. I had to really learn a lot in the early days. Yeah. So 2008 through 2010 or so, I was really, it was trial by fire. But even by 2010, I think Blue Acorn had developed a reputation, and I'd hired a couple of developers to work under me. And we were actually doing turnover work, so we were saving some of the early builds because really no one had any idea what was going on with Magento. There was no education. There were no documentation. And it was really just the early open source ecosystem that was putting education out there. And so, that was what, the early efforts of the Magento ecosystem, the people who understood open source, I did not at the time. I was unfamiliar with the concept. They helped me become a good Magento developer. And then just through through Blue Acorn's reputation, I ended up getting a chance to teach the Magento Fundamentals course, which was a week-long intensive on-site, in person. And I did that 2011 through 2012, pretty much split my time between Blue Acorn and training, 1 week in the US, 1 week abroad. And they had released a video, like the fifth class that I taught. Thankfully, I was working with Vinay Kopp, who's over at Huva now, which is one of the most amazing people I've ever met in my life. Consummate educator, and he kind of taught me while we were teaching the course. And eventually you go and you learn things like, oh wow, this is actually a Java app, but it was just written in PHP. So after a couple of years, I guess I'd kind of figured things out enough, and they'd they released a video of me doing the training, and that was really where my notoriety had kind of took off. Again, not through any plans or fault of my own. And then I guess, and then we had some other things that I was doing naturally, just interacting with people online, helping to kind of curate the online community, just sort of as in my nature. Got a special dedicated like Stack Overflow for Magento called Magento Stack Exchange created. Against the odds, as far as the folks at Stack Exchange were concerned, they actually killed the first attempt And and there was a lot of pushback. They said, no, this stuff really belongs on Stack Overflow. And I said, well, you can't, because you have people who are asking operational questions like how to configure products. And then you have people, handling the programmatic side of it. And I said, and these two things you can't separate them. So they really, and there's enough volume that I think we can do it. And then we sort of went through the beta there, got it done. And it became, I think it was like, for a time, it was like the top 5% of all of the Stack Exchange network sites in terms of traffic. So that was the corpus of knowledge. In fact, if you were asking your favorite LLM or code, agentic code assistant or whatever, anything about Magento development, I guarantee you a lot of its understanding of the code base is coming from that body of, 20,000 or more questions or whatever over Stack Exchange. Anyway, so that's a quick tour through like what kind of got me into a position where people might know who I am if I happen to walk into a room of Magento folks.
Yeah, that goes way back. One thing that I find interesting in this industry, and I go back pretty far too. I go back to the 90s actually. Late 90s, mid 90s, late 90s.
Do we even have computers back then?
Yeah, dude. I'm telling you, man. There were no e-commerce platforms when I was started, so we were kind of building our own from scratch. But anyway, the point was I was in New York City at the time, a Midwestern kid, and I have an art degree, so I studied sculpture, and I ended up just trying to, make ends meet. I was in a band too. So here I am, like this artist, and I'm like trying to pay rent in New York City, and I got a job animating. Totally. And I could draw, so I got a job animating, and that gig ended. Oh, cool. And then I was like, I need more work. What do you got? And they said, do you know HTML? And I was like, well, not yet. So I went home. I taught myself. I ended up at this production company called Radical Media. We were building an internet or a digital department. And like everybody had a weird background. Like there were philosophers, mathematicians, musicians. And that was my experience in those early days, is that the industry really attracted people that weren't necessarily like computer scientists to start. And I was wondering if you had a similar experience, because obviously your background isn't necessarily in computer science.
Yeah, I mean, in high school, I honestly have a history. Like, I think my first job at a grocery store, I was just kind of funny and charming and 15, and that kind of got me in. And then I got a job in high school. I got put to the top of a stack of applications, and it was doing pro audio repair. So I was already playing drums by then, but local music shop had a separate shop inside by this guy. Started by this guy, Andy Turner. He went on to start Magento, which is actually still a major supplier of especially like tube amp components. Really, really smart guy. But, I guess, he just kind of brought me in because I had a funny cover letter, and he kind of figured that I had a personality that would, I like to be able to like tinker with things and investigate. And I'd taken every electric device in my house apart at least once. Always have screws left over, which is why my wife doesn't let me touch her airplane from a maintenance standpoint. But everything, would work after I put it back together, more or less. And I think that sort of tinkerer mindset, and sort of the fair reliability, like when you're dealing with like solid state or even a tube amp system, like as long as you know inputs and outputs, like you can go through the chain of components along the way. And if you find like an aberration or something that's just either a waveform that's not right, or a voltage that's there or not, or too much, too little, like you can trace that back. Like it's linear, right? And as long as you have the ability to hold the context of what you're doing and what's going on in your brain, like I think that maps pretty well. And that's why, I think some of the most amazing architects and engineers I've met in the programming space have had like electrical engineering degrees. So they have like the full discipline. I liken it to being, a drummer, like someone who plays a drum set versus a percussionist who's studied music theory and everything else. I'm the former. Yeah. At the time I was meeting, when I was chatting with other developers, it was like the vector into programming, quote unquote, was, a very simple a fairly simple PHP. This was the days of PHP 4, so object orientation was not really fully fledged. They had just sort of transmogrified the array structure, in the compiler to like sort of be kind of objecty. It had weird like knock-on things that would happen if you were trying to build like a full-fledged system. PHP 5 really solved a lot of that, but you had a lot of people who were like coming in through WordPress. And they were like, and it starts like HTML is the first hit that hooks you, like in your case, right? So you start to get in the structural nature of things, though. It again, it's linear processing. It's nested hierarchies. I think this works for a certain mindset, and I was able to be, what I thought was a decent amount. I'd never studied, functional notation or or any of the classic like programming discipline stuff, but PHP is an incredibly forgiving language. Like a Java, if you're doing something in Java and you screw up, you get null exception pointer, stack trace. PHP is like, oh hey, I think you forgot a semicolon on line 37 of this file, and I think that was it's a very low barrier to entry, which is good and bad. Depending on your perspective. It's given PHP a tough rap over the years because it was easy to build things in PHP. So, if anyone can do it, the quality may not be up to snuff relative to, sort of the strictness of C or any of its derivatives or Java. But I think, when you get enough people in the room, you basically have this critical mass where you create space for people to, like sift to the top, or there becomes plenty of headroom to like move into. And again, I was really lucky to have spent time hands-on, with Vinay and learn a lot of the things that I didn't know from him. And then I was able to quickly fill in a lot of the blanks, and started to recognize some of the characteristics of Magento that meant like, hey, this is something fundamentally different that requires a very different perspective than WordPress does. And I'm not establishing a hierarchy, between those two particular apps. I'm just saying they are different, serve different purpose, and a different mentality applies to each of them.
I was also thinking about how this open source community. There was also the early days of web, which where I started, but there was a lot of people that migrated to it who were kind of naturally curious and naturally problem solvers. And I thought that attracted a lot of artists because I always thought that they were kind of in that camp. Some musicians have an uncanny ability to just break things and fix them and like tinker on things. There's a lot of innovations that have come out of the music industry. So I just find it interesting that the open source community has a kind of do-it-yourself ethos, and it's kind of creates a cool culture in that way.
Yeah, I mean it's a good analog, right? Because you do end up like musicians tend to be communal. You have some who are totally heads down and they come out with this opus that changes an entire industry. But also there is fond reference, you could say. I mean, some people might say, "Oh, you stole that rhythm, or you stole that harmony," or but you're building on what's come before, and maybe you're synthesizing something new, and it's all additive, but it's also participatory. Like so, you're participating in a scene, and that scene involves your fellow musicians. It also involves an audience. And kind of a marketplace and a space for all of that to exist. I remember playing shows in college, where you had four bands, for 3 or 4 hours, right, one after another in these clubs that only existed because an owner was not trying to make a bunch of money. They just wanted to create a cool space. And I think it does actually map pretty well into especially the open source side of things, right? So my career as a musician. Certainly benefited from being in situations where you could discover your peers and sort of aspirationally like significantly better players and learn from it. And keep in mind, kids, this is way before YouTube, so there was no like watching someone break something down and perfectly produce it, beat by beat or, note by note, you really had to be present and pay attention to and have actual discussions with people to figure out like, hey man, how'd you do that lick? Or, what was that? How'd you pull off that arpeggio, whatever. There's a good bit of that, I think, in open source. I don't know exactly. I don't think I could prognosticate about what the implications are for that in the modern context, but I guess that's one thing we'll be figuring out soon enough.
Yeah. But no, I mean, we get off this point in a second, but I also like that, being a musician is also being an entrepreneur. So there's also kind of like, it's not just do it yourself, but you're creating something new. Oftentimes you might be doing covers or whatever, but you have to kind of market yourself and you got to put yourself out there. And there's a lot of like executive function that has to happen around, showing up on time and getting together with other people. And so I love the, not to belabor this point, but to me, the magic of open source is the fact that you build a community of people that have a common interest, and the capacity to build something can become enterprise level quality without necessarily a massive billion-dollar corporation backing you up.
Yeah, and I can give you, the parallel of like a hackathon where, where people are just showing up, and basically it's whether hackathon or unconference or something like, just sort of by the event itself is sort of self-curating, and sort of by virtue of being in that room, right? And I think you could expand this out to open source ecosystems in general, not just one-off events, but like, you can show up and you probably will have something to offer. You may not know that, you only discover it, but you'll have something to offer, and you'll certainly have something to learn. And you're all speaking a common diction. There were plenty of gigs towards the end of my full-time career playing music where I would go out. There's a big cover band circuit here in Charleston, and I might show up to a gig, and it's four people playing in this band, and all four of us are introducing ourselves to each other because we've never played together before. But we know the typical set list, and as a drummer, it's super easy. Like, I don't even have to worry about key changes or anything. So, but you get a little bit of orientation, but you have like, you're all speaking the same language. You have contextual sort of commonalities, and you end up putting on a great show. And those were always really fun because you really, there again, like you really have to be paying attention. It's sort of active. There's the joy of playing, but there's also the active participation and listening, because you've got fractions of a second to like sort of respond to where something's going. They're really hard. We could probably write a beautiful sonnet on the topic.
Well, I think that it also I'm leaning in on the power of community, importance of community in open source a little bit, but as through this metaphor. But another example, like you said, the hackathon, but another example was when I moved in. I'm not a big city person, but I moved to New York City to follow a woman who I ended up marrying and having children with. So it was a good call on my part. But I spent 7 years there. But this was before, cell phones and the internet was just starting. So it was like, late 90s. But New York City felt like the electrons were closer together and they were moving faster. So like whatever you wanted to learn, the environment helped you learn it faster because you're shoulder to shoulder with people, and the culture itself is kind of moving quickly. I think a lot of things are changed now, obviously, with, people on their devices, and we have these, virtual communities. But this idea of, learning through a group in the sense that you're sharing ideas quickly and that you're kind of, you're getting to that common knowledge together. That idea of community has, I think, a ton of value, particularly when it, open source.
I mean, community matters because like not everyone can be self-starting. I'm not a great self-starter. I need some kind of waypoint, or even just the faintest outline of something to start to orient myself towards a space. People who can be the boundary makers or the waypoint layers or whatever. It's an amazing skill. But I'd say that's a vast minority or tiny minority of people out there. So it's if we were having this discussion and we were going around a room of developers from all over, like you would find that everyone's entry point is, even if they had a similar path, like, oh, we both went to the same university, or we both, were in the same space and started doing something, like the motivations are their own, and sort of their trajectory, somehow how they vectored in and their trajectory inside a community, it's very individual. But the good thing is that community kind of creates that space for you to say, okay, like, kind of how do I fit in? Where do I slot in? What value can I bring? What value, do I get from others? And what are the rules of engagement that are inherent in that? I mean, that was a lot of the work that I was doing once I actually went to work for Magento full time from like 2014 all the way through 2021, was helping the community, to, self-regulate. I mean, they're largely self-curating, right? Any good ecosystem is. So it didn't come down to me or Sherry. But we could help with specific instances. We could also help, most importantly, I think at the strategic level, like making sure that there was alignment between, Magento as an OEM and then the Magento ecosystem, right? And if because if Magento was saying something and doing something different, or not living up to something, a promise, like we would hear about it, or we might hear about, like, hey, there's something happening, at a sort of enterprise sales level, but it seems kind of counter to the values of an open source ecosystem. And, we were thankfully trusted by the leadership. I reported to an SVP at Magento, so I had basically direct access to the entire executive team. And so we could raise issues like of significant importance, and a huge credit to, Mark Leonard, Mark Lavelle, Gary. Gary was an amazing sales leader, right? Because he absolutely had every reason to hate a free competitor with the same badging as the commercial product, but he understood. And I heard him say this in front of a group of partners in Singapore. He completely understood that, like, the entire enterprise business relied on sort of the gravitas and the gravity of a massive ecosystem, right?
Yeah.
So it was a special time. I will say that, like, we'll never have that market, that opportunity ever again. And for everyone who went through that at the time, like from 2010 up through 2018, 2019, 2020, like, it was special. And it will never come back, certainly not in that form.
Yeah. All right. That's a good ending point. So we'll tee up the next episode with Ben, but just to summarize, Ben had been a major component of the Magento community for years, and now he's back. He's bringing that experience to the Magento community as the global community director. And on our next episode, we'll talk to Ben about the future of the Magento Association.